Hello, family. God bless you again. And we will pick up with Enoch chapter 86. Hope everybody's doing well. And again, I looked with my eyes as I slept, and I saw the heaven above, and behold, a star fell from heaven. And it arose and ate and pastured among those oxen. And after that, I saw the large and the black oxen. And behold, they all changed their stalls and pastures and their heifers, and began to live with each other. And again I saw in the vision, and looked toward heaven. And behold, I saw many stars descend and cast themselves down from heaven to that first star. And they became bulls among those cattle, and pastured them. And I looked at them and saw they all let out their private members like horses and began to mount the cows of the bulls. And they all became pregnant and bore elephants, camels, and asses. And all the bulls feared them that were frightened of them, and began to bite with their teeth and to devour and to gore with their horns. And moreover, they began to devour those oxen. And behold, all the children of the earth began to tremble and shake before them and to flee from them. Chapter 87. And again, I saw how they began to gore each other and to devour each other, and the earth began to cry aloud. And I raised my eyes again to heaven, and I saw in the vision, and behold, there came out from heaven beings who were like white men. And 4 went out from that place, and 3 others with them. And those 3 had come out last grasped me by my hand and took me up, away from the generations of the earth, and raised me up to a high place, and showed me a tower raised high above the earth, and all the hills were lower. And one said to me, "Remain here until you see everything that befalls those elephants, camels, and asses, and the stars, and the oxen, and all of them." Chapter 88. And I saw one of those 4 who had come out first, and he seized that first star which had fallen from heaven, and bound it hand and foot, and cast it into an abyss. And now that abyss was narrow and deep, and horrible and dark. And one of them drew a sword and gave it to those elephants and camels and asses. Then they began to smite each other, and the whole earth shook because of them. And as I was beholding in the vision, one of those 4 who had come out stoned them from heaven, and gathered and took all the great stars whose private members were like those of horses, and bound them all hand and foot, and threw them in an abyss of the earth. Chapter 89. And one of those 4 went to the white bull and instructed him in a secret. And he was terrified. He was born a bull and became a man, and built for himself a great vessel that dwelt on it. And 3 bulls dwelt with him in the vessel, and they were covered over. And again I raised my eyes toward heaven, and saw a high roof with 7 water torrents on it. And those torrents flowed with much water into an enclosure. And I looked again, and behold, fountains were opened on the surface of the great enclosure. And the water began to bubble and swell and rise on the surface. And I saw that enclosure until all its surface was covered with water. And the water, the darkness, and mist increased on it. And as I looked at the height of that water, the water had risen above the height of the enclosure and was streaming over the enclosure, and it stood on the earth. And all the cattle of the enclosure were gathered together until I saw how they sank and were swallowed up and perished in that water. But that vessel floated on the water, while all the oxen and the elephants and the camels and asses sank to the bottom with all the animals, so that I could no longer see them, and they were not able to escape, but perished and sank into the depths. And again I watched in the vision until those water torrents were removed from that high roof, and the chasms of the earth were leveled up, and other abysses were opened. Then the water began to run down into these abysses until the earth became visible. But that vessel settled on the earth, and the darkness retired, and light appeared. But that white bull, which had become a man, came out of that vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of those 3 was white like that bull. And one of them was red as blood, and one black. And that white bull departed from them. And they began to bring out beasts of the field and birds, so that there arose different genera, lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, squirrels, swine, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. And among them was born a white bull. And they began to bite one another. But that white bull which was born among them fathered a wild ass and a white bull with it. And the wild asses multiplied. But that bull which was born from him fathered a black wild boar and a white sheep. And the former fathered many boars. But the sheep gave birth to 12 sheep. And when those 12 sheep had grown, they gave up one of them to the asses. And the asses again gave up that sheep to the wolves. And that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the Lord brought the 11 sheep to live with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves, and they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to fear them, and they oppressed them until they destroyed their little ones, and they threw their young into a deep river. But those sheep began to cry aloud on account of their little ones, and to complain to their Lord. And a sheep which had been saved from the wolves fled and escaped to the wild asses. And I saw the sheep, how they lamented and how they lamented and cried and besought their Lord with all their might, until that Lord of the sheep descended at the voice of the sheep from a high abode, and came to them and pastured them. And he called that sheep which had escaped the wolves, and spoke with it concerning the wolves, that it should admonish them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves according to the word of the Lord, and another sheep met it and went with it. And the two went and entered into the assembly of those wolves, and spoke with them, and admonished them not to touch the sheep from then on. And on it I saw the wolves, and how they more harshly oppressed the sheep with all their power. And the sheep cried aloud. And the Lord came to the sheep, and they began to beat those wolves. And the wolves began to make lamentations. But the sheep became quiet and ceased to cry out. And I saw the sheep until they departed from among the wolves. But the eyes of the wolves were blinded, and the wolves departed in pursuit of the sheep with all their power. And the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader, and all his sheep followed him. And his face was dazzling and glorious and terrible to behold. But the wolves began to pursue those sheep until they reached a sea of water. And that sea was divided, and the water stood on its side, and on that before their face. And their Lord led them, and placed himself between them and the wolves. And as those wolves had not yet seen the sheep, they proceeded into the midst of that sea, and the wolves followed the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that sea. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee before his face. But that sea gathered itself together and became as it had been created. And the water swelled and rose until it covered the wolves. And I watched until the wolves who pursued those sheep perished and were drowned. But the sheep escaped from that water and went out into the wilderness, to a wilderness, where there was no water and no grass. And they began to open their eyes and to see. And I saw the Lord of the sheep pasturing them and giving them water and grass, and that sheep going and leading them. And the sheep ascended to the summit of that high rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And after that, I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was great and terrible and majestic. And all those sheep saw him and were afraid before his face. And they all feared and trembled because of him. And they cried to that sheep which was among them, "We are not able to stand before our Lord or to behold him." And that sheep which led them again ascended to the summit of that rock. But the sheep began to be blinded and to wander from the way which he had shown them. But that sheep did not realize it. And the Lord of the sheep was very angry with them. And that sheep discovered it and went down from the summit of the rock and came to the sheep and found the greatest part of them blinded and fallen away. And when they saw it, they feared and trembled at its presence and desired to return to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with it and came to those sheep which had fallen away, and began to slay them. And the sheep feared its presence. And thus that sheep brought back those sheep that had fallen away, and they returned to their folds. And I saw in this vision until that sheep became a man and built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and placed all the sheep in that house. And I saw until this sheep which had met that sheep which led them fell asleep. And I saw until all the great sheep perished, and little ones arose in their place. And they came to a pasture and approached a stream of water. Then that sheep, their leader, which had become a man, withdrew from them and fell asleep. And all the sheep looked for it and cried over it with a great crying. And I saw until they left off crying for that sheep and crossed that stream of water. And there arose the two sheep as leaders in the place of those which had led them and fallen asleep. And I saw until the sheep came to a good place and a pleasant and glorious land. And I saw until those sheep were satisfied, and that house stood among them in the pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were open, and sometimes blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs and the foxes and the wild boars began to devour those sheep, until the Lord of the sheep raised up another sheep, a ram from their midst, which led them. And that ram began to butt on either side those dogs, foxes, and wild boars, until he had destroyed them all. And that sheep whose eyes were open saw that ram, which was among the sheep, until it forsook its glory and began to butt those sheep, and trampled on them, and behaved itself unseemly. And the Lord of the sheep sent the lamb to another lamb, and raised it to being a ram and leader of the sheep, instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory. And it went to it and spoke to it alone, and raised it to being a ram, and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. But doing all these things, those dogs oppressed the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled before it. And I saw until those dogs pulled down the first ram. And the second ram arose and led the little sheep, and those sheep grew and multiplied. But all the dogs and foxes and wild boars feared and fled before it. And that ram butted and killed the wild beasts, and those wild beasts had no longer any power among the sheep, and robbed them no more of anything. And that ram fathered many sheep and fell asleep. And a little sheep became ram in its place, and became prince and leader of those sheep. And that house became great and broad, and it was built for those sheep. And a high and great tower was built on the house for the Lord of the sheep. And that house was low, but the tower was elevated and high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they offered a full table before him. Excuse me. And again I saw those sheep that they again erred and went many ways, and forsook that their house. And the Lord of the sheep called some from among the sheep, and sent them to the sheep. But the sheep began to slay them, and one of them was saved, and was not slain. And it sped away and cried aloud over the sheep. And they sought to slay it, but the Lord of the sheep saved it from the sheep, and brought it up to me, and caused it to live there. And many other sheep he sent to those sheep to testify to them and lament over them. And after that I saw that when they forsook the house of the Lord and his tower, they fell away entirely, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw the Lord of the sheep, how he worked much slaughter among them in their herds, until those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And he gave them over into the hands of the lions and tigers and wolves and hyenas, and into the hand of the foxes, and to all the wild beasts. And those wild beasts began to tear in pieces those sheep. And I saw that he forsook their house and their tower, and gave them all into the hand of the lions, to tear and devour them, and into the hand of all the wild beasts. And I began to cry aloud with all my power, and to appeal to the Lord of the sheep, because the sheep were being devoured by all the wild beasts. But he remained unmoved, though he saw it, and rejoiced that they were devoured and swallowed and robbed, and left them to be devoured in the hand of all the beasts. And he called 70 shepherds, and gave those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he spoke to the shepherds and their companions, let each individual of you pasture the sheep from now on, and everything that I shall command you that you do. And I will deliver them over to you, duly numbered, and tell you which of them are to be destroyed, and them you will destroy. And he gave over to them those sheep. And he called another and spoke to him, observe and mark everything that the shepherds will do to those sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. And every excess that the destruction which will be done through the shepherds, record how many they destroy according to my command, and how many according to their own caprice. Record against every individual shepherd all the destruction he effects. And read out before me by number how many they destroy, and how many they deliver over for destruction, that I may have this as a testimony against them, and know every deed of the shepherds, that I may comprehend and see what they do, whether or not they abide by my command which I have commanded them. But they shall not know it, and you shall not declare it to them, nor admonish them, but only record against each individual all the destruction with which the shepherds effect, each in his time, and lay it all before me. And I saw until those shepherds pastured in their season, and they began to slay and to destroy more than they were bidden. And they delivered those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and tigers ate and devoured the greater part of those sheep. And the wild boars ate along with them, and they burned that tower and demolished that house. And I became very sorrowful over that tower, because that house of the sheep was demolished. And afterwards I was unable to see if those sheep entered that house. And the shepherds and their associates delivered over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them, and each one of them received in his time a definite number. It was written by the other in a book how many each one of them destroyed of them. And each one slew and destroyed many more than was prescribed. And I began to weep and lament on account of those sheep. And thus in the vision I saw that one who wrote, how he wrote down every one that was destroyed by those shepherds, day by day, and carried up and laid down and showed actually the whole book to the Lord of the sheep, everything that they had done and all that each one of them had made away with, and all that they had given over to destruction. And the book was read before the Lord of the sheep, and he took the book from his hand and read it and sealed it and laid it down. And I saw how the shepherds pastured for 12 hours, and behold, 3 of those sheep turned back and came and entered and began to build up all that had fallen down of that house. But the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they were not able. And they began again to build as before, and they raised up that tower, and it was named the High Tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. And as touching all this, the eyes of those sheep were blinded, so that they saw not. And the eyes of their shepherds likewise were blinded, and they delivered them in large numbers to their shepherds for destruction. And they trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained unmoved until all the sheep were dispersed over the field and mingled with the beast. And the shepherds did not save them out of the hand of the beast. And this one who wrote the book carried it up and showed it and read it before the Lord of the sheep, and implored him on their account, and besought him on their account, as he showed him all the doings of the shepherds, and gave testimony before him against all the shepherds. And he took the actual book and laid it down beside him and departed. Thank you for listening, family. Love you. God bless you.